Then we look at environmental change in terms of invasive species, essentially species that don't belong there, species that were brought from somewhere else and brought to an area in which they don't come from. In the previous discussion, which we focused in on the human-caused alteration of species, we focused in on removal. Now we'll look at redistribution. Key term here is invasive species, and these are another definition would be that they're alien invaders of exotic species. Star Wars fan, Star Trek fan, I bet you love that definition. The idea here is species that aren't native to an area are brought to an area. So one of the things why this is critical is they take over a particular food chain, or they take over a particular land area, and so these niche takeovers can be costly to those that were already there, those previous natives to a particular area. Now we're going to look at an invasive species, a non-native species that's been brought to the United States from Japan called Kudzu. This was brought over during the 1800s during the World's Fair. Kudzu is how you spell this, and it's this ivy that's blanketing these trees that we see here in this image. How did this get here? World's Fair, it was brought over here. It was seen something as an ornamental. If you had before air conditioning, so the wealthy people, what they would do is they would have this kudzu grow over their back porch, and so provide some shade and some color over a trellis, trellis. So here we see how this then evolved into something that the wealthy used. But then when it came the 1930s, one of the things is we were heavily converting our land to agriculture. This is during the Great Depression, and a lot of people were doing this in areas that probably wouldn't have been too good for ag. And so one of the things they did was it caused a lot of erosion, especially there along highways a little bit later on, once highways came through areas, and they would use this kudzu to help keep the dirt from blowing across, and so they kind of would plant this stuff because it would quickly grow and provide a little bit of stability to the soil. But then over time in the southeast United States, this stuff grew big time. Why did it grow so well in the southeast? Which is a climate a lot like they found in the Japanese area this originally resides. It's quite warm and quite lush. And so now this invasive species, what it's done is it's covered up much of the areas along highways that was, like I said, used for erosion purposes, and essentially blanketed and removed a lot of trees. And so here we see the redistribution kudzu, which might grow properly in a certain area, is brought now to the United States, where it then covers up the native population, the native trees that we see in this case here. So kind of the evolution of kudzu over time, and it's one of the things that's quite difficult because it grows so well. It's, you can't really catch up to it. And so another problem is you have to remove the root. So if you come in here hacking at it, you're not going to get rid of the kudzu because you have to actually pull up every single bit. And so in some places they actually brought goats in because goats actually go because they like the roots, and so they actually go after the roots. So it's kind of interesting how this has become a major problem, but a major cultural thing in the American Southeast. Here we see a nice little innocent little guy here, this Arctic fox. Well, maybe he's not so innocent. Here we have two islands from the Aleutian Islands, which are an island arc chain there in the Pacific Rim, where we have two ocean plates colliding, creating that island arc. But anyway, here we have the Niski Island on the left and Bull Deer on the right. And so here we have islands that are right next to each other, formed from the same principal idea as far as what formed them. But on one, they have 100 times more seabirds than the other. Niski Island has changed considerably. I know this is a blurry picture here, but we can see the color of it. It doesn't have that much green. It's got green on the tips. It's got, especially where that blue dot is, it's got a lot of lighter colored, almost browns and not the green lushness we'll see in Bull Deer. So this island's definitely changed over time. Compared here to Bull Deer, which we zoomed in, we can see it's quite lush. Like I said, there's not much difference between these two islands, other than in their vegetation. On the left is Bull Deer Island, and on the right is Niski Island. And so essentially, over time, Niski Island has converted from what we would see on the left to what we see on the right. So it's almost from creating a completely different vegetation type, which one's more of a grassland, more shrubs, a little bit more dense vegetation, where the other one, much more sparse vegetation. We've got more browns we can see here, and so you don't see as much lushness as we see on the one on the left. Some seabirds we'd find here On Bull Deer Island, the one with the dense vegetation, which also has 100 times more seabirds, are puffins. And so puffins, we would see these guys, but also gulls, and so puffins and gulls. But one of the things is these over time became removed. So on Niski Island, there aren't any seabirds. Those puffins and those gulls were removed by a particular individual, the old Arctic fox. And so this Arctic fox was an invasive species to Niski Island, but the Arctic fox was never introduced to Bull Deer Island. And so this guy here eats puffins, and he also eats gulls. And so he's a predator. So he was brought into this area in which he was not native, and he's removed, in the case of Niski Island, all of the critters, all the birds. What does this have to do with humans? Russian traders, Russian fur traders during the 1800s actually came to this area and were actually looking for sea otters and sea lions, and looking for these particular animals with these desired furs, not the Arctic fox. What they did was they brought the Arctic fox there for hunting, but also in case they themselves needed some fur, they would use the Arctic foxes, and so they would actually let them run free. But they also, helped to remove some pests and some burdens, and so they used them for those purposes there. But then, of course, when they depleted an area, when they over-harvested an area of sea otters, they would just essentially go to the next island, but they would leave the Arctic foxes behind. And so the Arctic foxes, what they do is they eat the birds, and the birds, what they do is they take in nutrients from ocean aquatic life, and then they, using guano, which is just essentially another word for poop, they then poop it out onto the islands, and then what that essentially is, it's fertilizer. So it's why it's so lush and dense vegetation there is actually from the guano, from the feces, from the birds that have, there are many gulls and many puffins there in Bull Deer that essentially are helping to enrich the soil with key ingredient would be phosphorus. So that's one of the things that's found in the feces. So here we see the invasive species being the Arctic fox coming in and actually changing the vegetation type found in a particular area.